Let's talk about one of the quiet workhorses of modern healthcare: hospital equipment, monitoring, and drug delivery. Imagine a patient in a hospital bed. Around them, you see monitors tracking heart rate and oxygen, pumps pushing fluids and medicines, ventilators helping them breathe, and lots of single-use items like drapes, syringes, and catheters that keep everything safe and sterile. All of that together is this block. Today, this block generates roughly $200 to $250 billion in revenue every year. Over the next 3 to 5 years, it's expected to grow at about 6 to 9% annually, then settle into 5 to 7% over 5 to 10 years. Within that, patient monitoring is a big growth engine on its own. It's already a $50 to $60 billion market in 2024, and it's expected to more than double to around $120 billion by the early 2030s. When you see the chart on patient monitoring market size on screen, that rising curve is exactly what we're talking about. What kinds of businesses live in this block? You have patient monitoring and respiratory care, which includes bedside monitors, telemetry systems, ventilators, and sleep apnea devices. You have infusion and IV therapy and drug delivery, the pumps, IV sets, administration sets, and packaging that actually get drugs and fluids into the body. You have infection prevention and medical surgical supplies, sterilizers, washers, disinfectants, drapes, and gowns. And then there are the everyday consumables: catheters, needles, syringes, wound care products, and other single-use items. These companies sell 4 main things. First, capital equipment: monitors, ventilators, infusion pumps, sterilization systems, and the servers and gateways that tie the network together. Second, consumables: IV sets and tubing, catheters and syringes, disposable sensors, packaging components, drapes, gowns, and disinfectants. Third, service and software: maintenance contracts, remote monitoring platforms, connections into hospital IT systems and analytics dashboards. And finally, in some cases, logistics and distribution services for medical surgical supplies and inventory management. The main customers are hospitals and health systems, with support from outpatient clinics and surgery centers, home care and sleep apnea providers, and the group purchasing organizations and governments who negotiate prices and contracts. In the value chain, this block sits midstream, at the point of care, between diagnosis and therapy. Once a patient has been diagnosed, this is the equipment that keeps them monitored, ventilated, hydrated, and safe. It connects directly to blocks like surgical and interventional platforms, diagnostic imaging and in vitro diagnostics, and healthcare distribution, which move all of these consumables around. To make this concrete, think about some illustrative listed companies, and to be clear, these are examples only, not stock recommendations. You have Baxter International in the US, a global supplier of infusion pumps, IV solutions, and hospital products. Becton Dickinson is a major provider of needles, syringes, catheters, and some diagnostics used daily in hospitals. ICU Medical focuses on infusion therapy, IV sets, and closed drug delivery systems. ResMed leads in respiratory and sleep apnea devices for both hospitals and home. Masimo specializes in pulse oximetry and advanced patient monitoring technology. Steris provides sterilization systems, washers, and infection prevention products. Teleflex offers a wide range of critical care and surgical disposables, including catheters and access devices. West Pharmaceutical Services supplies drug delivery and primary packaging components such as stoppers and seals for injectable medicines. Owens & Minor is a med-surg distributor and service provider supplying hospitals with a broad range of products. Indragerwerk produces patient monitors, ventilators, and anesthesia workstations for intensive and perioperative care. Among the innovators, Masimo has pushed pulse oximetry from a basic red light sensor to a multi-parameter monitoring platform that measures extra blood parameters, integrates wirelessly with hospital systems, and supports continuous monitoring on the ward and at home. That lets Masimo win long-term monitoring contracts instead of just competing on price. ResMed has taken hospital-grade respiratory technology into the home, especially sleep apnea and chronic respiratory markets. By combining connected devices with cloud-based monitoring and telemedicine tools, it helps providers manage patients outside the hospital and blurs the line between hospital equipment and consumer health. If we zoom out and look at the global medical devices chart on screen, this block is one of the big contributors to that multi-$100 billion market and its mid-single-digit growth story. So far, we've seen what this block is, who the main players are, and where it sits in the healthcare machine. Next, let's move to how these companies actually make money and what drives their economics, which is key for investors. At the heart of this block is the capital equipment plus consumables model, the classic razor and razor blade structure. A hospital buys infusion pumps, monitors, ventilators, or sterilizers as capital equipment. Once those fleets are installed, they generate recurring revenue for years through IV sets and tubing, disposable sensors, filters, and maintenance contracts. The big upfront sale effectively locks in a stream of consumable and service income. Alongside that, you have high-volume consumables businesses: syringes, needles, gloves, gowns, drapes, and wound care items. These are sold in bulk, often via distributors, on thin margins but enormous volumes. Then there is service and software, equipment maintenance, remote monitoring, clinical dashboards, connectivity tools. More of this is now sold on subscription or multi-year agreements rather than a one-off license. Finally, some players, such as distributors, run distribution and logistics models, making money on small spreads over massive volumes and on service fees for managing inventory. All of this ties up capital in several places. Companies invest in manufacturing plants and tooling for devices, sets, and packaging. They carry inventory of supplies and spare parts to guarantee continuous availability. They spend heavily on R&D and regulatory filings to meet strict safety standards. They build sales and service networks with field engineers, clinical specialists, and local warehouses. And they fund IT and software platforms for remote monitoring and integration. Economically, margins in this block depend heavily on product mix. High-tech monitoring and respiratory devices often earn 50 to 60% gross margins, and diversified players can see 10 to 20% operating margins at the portfolio level. By contrast, commodity supplies have much lower gross margins and rely on sheer volume and efficient manufacturing. Scale is critical. Large players spread regulatory, R&D, and service costs across a big installed base. Standardization and lock-in also help. Once a hospital standardizes on a particular vendor's pumps or monitors, it tends to keep buying matching sets and disposables, which supports margins. Several key drivers shape profitability and returns. First, hospital admission and procedure volumes. When admissions and surgeries grow, usage of IV sets, monitors, and respiratory support rises, and high-acuity beds drive demand for premium devices. Second, product mix and differentiation. Companies with more differentiated technology, smart pumps, advanced sensors, connectivity, have better pricing power than those selling basic gloves and syringes, and a higher share of monitoring, respiratory, and software revenue usually means higher margins. Third, pricing pressure from GPOs and tenders. Large purchasing organizations negotiate aggressively, squeezing margins on commoditized items. Differentiated products with clear clinical benefits can resist this pressure better. Fourth, the shift to home-based and remote care. As care moves outside hospital walls, demand grows for connected devices and home-use systems. Companies that adapt products and reimbursement models for home care get incremental, recurring revenue. And fifth, the cost of capital and hospital budgets. When interest rates rise and public finances are under strain, big capital equipment cycles get delayed. Firms with strong balance sheets can step in with financing or leasing to support sales. In terms of competition, high-tech monitoring and infusion systems are concentrated among a handful of global OEMs because of regulatory hurdles, long clinical validation cycles, and the need for reliable service networks. Consumables and basic supplies are fragmented and highly competitive, with many regional manufacturers. New entrants can more easily attack niche segments or software layers. But breaking into mainstream hospital fleets requires regulatory approvals, 24/7 service capabilities, and a strong reliability and safety track record. So we've covered how the business models work and what drives returns. Next, let's shift to the customers themselves: who they are, how often they use these products, and how sticky these relationships really are. The primary buyers are public and private hospitals, from large tertiary centers to smaller community hospitals. Outpatient surgery centers and clinics use monitors, pumps, and consumables for day case procedures. Home care providers and sleep clinics use respiratory devices and remote monitoring tools. And governments and group purchasing organizations often act as purchasing agents, negotiating regional or national contracts. Usage is intense. Monitors and pumps run whenever patients are in beds, often 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Consumables like IV sets, catheters, drapes, and syringes are used daily and constantly replaced. Once fleets of pumps and monitors are installed, they typically stay in place for 7 to 10 years or longer. Hospitals design workflows, training programs, alarm protocols, and IT interfaces around a specific vendor. Switching suppliers means retraining staff, revalidating safety protocols, and replacing or adjusting a large inventory of disposables. That makes these relationships very sticky, particularly for capital equipment paired with proprietary disposables. Order sizes range from small but frequent to very large and occasional. A single order for gloves or syringes might be only a few $1,000s, but it repeats again and again. A fleet upgrade of monitors or infusion pumps for a large hospital can run into millions of dollars, usually bundled with multi-year service and consumable commitments. On that business, differentiated device manufacturers can earn the 50 to 60% gross margins and 10 to 20% operating margins we discussed, while pure distributors or commodity suppliers are often stuck in the low single digits at the operating line. How much choice do customers have? For major categories like monitors and pumps, hospitals typically compare 3 to 5 global vendors, plus some regional ones. For commoditized supplies, there may be dozens of potential suppliers, but GPO contracts narrow this to a few preferred vendors. In remote and home monitoring, the choice set is narrower and still evolving, giving early leaders an advantage. You can see this shift visually in the charts on remote health monitoring and IoT in healthcare. The upward bars reflect that new layer of demand. In mature markets, the number of hospitals doesn't grow quickly, but device density per bed and monitoring intensity per patient keep rising. In emerging markets, hospital and clinic capacity is expanding faster, creating new institutional customers and lifting orders per customer as more patients are treated. The rise of hospital-at-home programs effectively adds another layer of customers, which you can see in the hospital-at-home market chart, where the market value steps up over time. So now we know who buys, how often they use the products, and how sticky the relationships are. The next question for investors is, how does all this behave when the macro environment changes? Overall, this block is more defensive than most sectors, but not completely immune. If the economy weakens, hospitals still need IV sets, monitors, and disinfectants, so consumable demand stays resilient. But if government or insurer budgets tighten, hospitals may defer big upgrades of monitors, ventilators, and sterilizers. If interest rates rise, hospitals' cost of capital goes up, debt-funded projects are delayed, and capital equipment sales become lumpier, while consumables hold up better. If input costs like plastics, energy, and logistics rise faster than prices, margins on low-value, tendered items get squeezed unless companies improve efficiency. If regulation tightens around safety, traceability, or cybersecurity, large, well-resourced OEMs benefit because they can absorb the added complexity, while smaller suppliers face higher compliance costs or exit markets. Behaviorally, for hospitals, these products are mostly must-have rather than discretionary. They cannot simply stop buying IV sets or monitors without risking patient safety. When budgets are stressed, they postpone instead of cutting, delaying upgrades and non-essential features but keeping the basic supplies flowing. Clinicians and biomedical engineers tend to be loyal to trusted brands with proven reliability. They are reluctant to switch providers for modest price savings because the risk of device failure is too high. GPOs and payers, on the other hand, are more price-sensitive and drive competitive tenders and volume discounts, especially in commoditized categories. We've now looked at how the block behaves through the cycle. Next, let's look back at what has changed over the last 3 to 5 years, and then we'll turn to the future outlook and scenarios. In the last 3 to 5 years, customer behavior has shifted in a few important ways. First, infection prevention has moved higher on the agenda after COVID. Hospitals are more willing to invest in sterilization, masks, drapes, and better room cleaning. The images you see on patient monitoring and medical devices growth also reflect this heightened focus. Second, remote monitoring and home-based care have become much more accepted, especially for chronic respiratory conditions and post-operative follow-up. Patients now expect to be monitored safely at home where possible. Third, hospitals are pushing for standardization and vendor consolidation to simplify training and reduce inventory complexity. On the commercial side, new channels and monetization models have emerged. Home and remote monitoring are mainstream in some conditions, with devices shipped directly to patients and data flowing back to clinicians. Vendors offer digital platforms, cloud dashboards, integration into electronic health records and alert systems, increasingly on subscription. Some companies provide managed service models, owning and maintaining the equipment and charging hospitals per bed, per patient, or per month, rather than selling devices outright. Technology and regulation have moved too. Devices are more connected and software-rich, which raises upfront R&D and cybersecurity costs but creates recurring software revenue opportunities. Regulators focus more on cybersecurity, interoperability, and post-market surveillance, raising the compliance bar. Supply chain shocks during the pandemic forced firms to rethink inventory, dual sourcing, and manufacturing footprints, changes that may keep structural costs somewhat higher but improve resilience. These shifts have changed where power and profitability sit. Power is moving from standalone commodity suppliers toward integrated solution providers that combine hardware, proprietary disposables, and software and analytics in one ecosystem. Large hospital systems and GPOs have gained bargaining power through consolidation, pressuring prices on standard items. At the same time, data and connectivity create new moats. Vendors that control patient monitoring data and clinical decision support tools become harder to displace and can capture a bigger share of the value. The most fragile positions are undifferentiated glove-and-gown manufacturers and small providers that lack the scale to meet modern regulatory and supply chain expectations. With that recent history in mind, let's finally turn to the future outlook: near-term, medium-term, and long-term, and then walk through 3 scenarios for how this block might play out for investors. Near-term, over the next 1 to 2 years, several things are likely to stay the same. Hospitals must keep beds, operating rooms, and ICUs running, so demand for IV sets, monitors, ventilators, and infection prevention products remains essential. The capital plus consumables model stays at the core. Equipment fleets continue to generate recurring revenue from proprietary sets, sensors, and service contracts. And GPOs and large health systems remain key gatekeepers for pricing and vendor selection. Some elements are set to shrink or fade. Residual COVID-specific demand, the surge in PPE and pandemic-level ventilator orders, continues to normalize. Older devices without connectivity or IT integration attract less new demand, as hospitals prefer systems that support remote monitoring and analytics. On the growth side, remote and home monitoring adoption keeps rising, especially where reimbursement is clear. Sleep apnea, chronic respiratory disease, and some cardiac monitoring. Hospitals invest in upgraded monitoring infrastructure that integrates bedside data with electronic health records and central surveillance dashboards. Emerging markets add beds and basic monitoring capacity, supporting higher growth for global OEMs. The charts you see for remote monitoring and hospital-at-home markets are visual examples of this trend. Over the medium term, 3 to 5 years out, the block likely remains relatively defensive, anchored by aging populations, chronic disease, and baseline hospital activity. Large, diversified players still dominate, and consumables and service remain the main profit engines. What might fade? Pure commodity suppliers without differentiation may lose share to larger, more efficient manufacturers, or to private label products. Hospitals may reduce the number of vendors, squeezing out smaller brands in favor of system-wide contracts. Manual, standalone equipment without connectivity becomes harder to sell in advanced markets. What could grow? Integrated monitoring platforms that combine bedside devices, central surveillance, alarm management, and analytics. Hospital at home and step-down programs that use hospital-grade devices in the home, shifting some demand out of the traditional ward. More as-a-service models where hospitals pay per patient, per monitored bed, or per month, instead of buying equipment outright, smoothing demand and deepening relationships. Workflow automation, smart pumps that reduce medication errors, automated disinfection systems, and data-driven staffing tools should also expand. For investors, this is the period where platform depth, connectivity, and support for home care models will increasingly separate winners from laggards. Over the long term, 7 to 10 years, some foundations look durable. Aging populations, chronic disease, and higher acuity continue to support baseline demand. Regulators and payers keep focusing on patient safety and infection control, backing ongoing investment in monitoring and prevention. Hospitals and health systems still need trusted, proven vendors for mission-critical equipment, yet some aspects may shrink. More care moves from large hospitals to outpatient centers and home care, which may cap bed growth in mature markets even as monitoring intensity per patient rises. Basic, non-smart devices and undifferentiated consumables become fully commoditized, with margins under constant tender pressure and more offshoring. Vendors that never build strong software or data capabilities risk getting stuck in the lowest value parts of the chain. Meanwhile, new areas can emerge strongly. AI-driven, always-on monitoring that automatically detects deterioration and reduces alarm fatigue. Disposable or wearable sensors usable both in hospital and at home. Closed-loop drug delivery systems where pumps adjust based on continuous monitoring data. And larger global platforms formed through consolidation, offering end-to-end equipment, disposables, and data services across regions. Putting this into 3 scenarios. In an upside, bull-type scenario, connected home extended hospitals. Governments and insurers actively support hospital-at-home and remote monitoring to reduce costly readmissions and ICU stays. Reimbursement frameworks reward preventative monitoring and automation that reduce complications and nurse workload. AI-enabled monitoring proves its value, cutting adverse events without adding excessive cost, so adoption accelerates. Emerging markets increase healthcare investment, adding large numbers of monitored beds and modern infection prevention infrastructure. In this world, the block grows at the upper end of the 6 to 9% range or slightly above, and companies with integrated hardware plus software platforms and strong home care offerings enjoy margin expansion, high returns on capital, and stronger consolidation. In a base, normal scenario, steady workhorse of acute care. Global economic growth is modest and public finances are tight, but acute care stays a funding priority. Hospitals steadily upgrade equipment and roll out remote monitoring, where cost-effectiveness is clearly proven, but adoption is gradual. Tender and GPO pressure keeps commodity pricing under strain, but mix shifts toward differentiated devices and software offset part of the margin impact. Emerging markets keep building capacity, but not at breakneck pace. The result is mid-single-digit to high single-digit revenue growth and stable margins for well-positioned players. A reliable compounder rather than a hypergrowth story. In a downside, bear-type scenario, CapEx freeze and hard tenders, prolonged fiscal stress and high interest rates push governments and hospital systems to freeze or slash capital budgets. Aggressive tendering, volume-based procurement, and price caps spread into more device categories, squeezing margins. Reimbursement for home-based and remote monitoring stays patchy, so adoption stalls. New low-cost producers from emerging markets gain share in devices and supplies, where regulations permit cheaper imports. Growth slows to low single digits. Some segments may even decline in real terms. Margins compress, especially for firms heavily exposed to commoditized products or regions with strict procurement policies. Consolidation accelerates, but investors see more volatile earnings and lower sector multiples until policies stabilize. For a long-term investor looking at any company in hospital equipment, monitoring, and drug delivery, the key questions are simple. What share of its portfolio is differentiated versus commoditized? How much of its revenue is recurring consumables and service versus one-off capital sales? And is it positioned to benefit from remote care and connectivity, or is it stuck in legacy categories most exposed to tender pressure? Answering those questions thoughtfully is what turns this complex, behind-the-scenes block into a clear investment story.